talk to yourself? Of course you have. But did you know that the way you talk to yourself can kind of help you, goodness. But have you noticed that the things you say to yourself can either be helpful or harmful to you? Well, in this video, I'm going to talk about how you can pay attention to the things that you say to yourself so that you don't become your own worst enemy. Isn't it strange that as human beings, we want to ask this question, why? Why did this happen? Why did that happen? Why did this happen rather than that? As humans, we find this desire to impose reason on things in our lives. In fact, even when things don't seem to make sense, we want to ask the question why and try to make sense out of something that was perhaps completely random. And when we do that, what we're actually doing is we're creating a narrative. In fact, the worse the incident, the more personal the incident, the more we feel the need to create a narrative around why that happened. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, it's just a thing that happens. And we often create and live by these self-imposed narratives. And if this narrative is not accurate, if it doesn't reflect reality, we can become our own worst enemy. Here's something you can do to identify those self-imposed narratives that you have about yourself or others. Pay attention to your narratives. I know, genius, right? But think about it for a moment. What did you tell yourself about your parents when you were in high school? You know, it was always like, oh, they don't understand, or they won't let me go to that party. If they just understood what I know to be true, they wouldn't let me go. But then over time that started to change, didn't it? You got older, you moved out of home. All of a sudden your parents became more cool in a way. You went to them for advice. You needed to get answers from them, and your narrative about your parents changed. Oh, hello. And the reality is all of us have narratives around certain people or certain things in our lives. Narratives like I'm entitled to, I deserve, I should be, I need to have. And we all create these narratives. The problem is that narratives, well, they kind of create excuses. You wouldn't call them excuses though, you'd call them justifications. And narratives justify racism, they justify prejudice, they justify why you won't call him, why you won't call her, why you don't talk to them anymore. And these false narratives that we have, they're actually so difficult to overcome because they're shaped by a number of things that honestly, you and I had no control over. They're shaped by where we grew up. And I didn't choose where we grew up. They're shaped by the kind of family that we had. And for the most part, we couldn't have a hand in the type of family we grew up with. They're shaped by the type of education we had, the type of school we went to, the area we lived in. And so much has been written about narratives and the narratives we tell ourselves by people far smarter than me. But one thing that we all know to be true is our internal narratives actually shape our decisions. But our internal narratives also have the potential to help us become our own worst enemy. Now, I want to let you in on something cool. And the cool thing I want to let you in on was something that was written 2,000 years ago by a guy called Paul. Now, if you're new here on the channel, you might not know Paul, but you might like Paul, particularly if you're not a Jesus follower, because Paul steps onto the pages of history not as a Jesus follower, but as a mercenary out to take down the church. And Paul has an encounter with Jesus, and all of a sudden his life transforms, and he sets out on this mission to help people understand the views and the values that Jesus introduced into the world. And in this particular document that we're going to look at in this video, Paul's writing to a church in Corinth. And Corinth is this very big secular port city that didn't have any of the views or the values that Jesus introduced into the world. They had values like might made right. People are property. They viewed the world that the gods determine the fates of the people. And into this world, into a culture that believed these types of narratives, Paul challenges them to rethink some of their narratives. And because Paul knew how challenging it would be to reshape the Corinthians' narratives, he uses military terminology, which is actually kind of helpful for us today. This is what he says. He goes, "For though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does." In other words, we don't conduct military campaigns like the war does, we don't conduct military campaigns like the world does. He says, "The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have the power to demolish strongholds." And then he says this, "We demolish arguments." And what he's saying to you and what he's saying to me is that we are actually to wage war on flawed conclusions based on false assumptions. Again, remember back to high school when your parents weren't cool, and then all of a sudden as you grew up and you got to know them in a different way, that narrative changed. And that's what we're to do about things that really matter. We're to wage war on them. He goes on to say, we demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. In other words, if you're a Jesus follower, or if you were to ever become a Jesus follower, what we are to do is to tackle head on our flawed assumptions about ourselves, about the people around us, and about the world around us. And Paul says the way we are to do that is to take captive every thought. Now, this is prisoner of war language. Bend it, to mold it, to shape it, until it becomes and lines up with the values that Jesus introduced into the world. This is why, for me, it's so fascinating reading the 4 biographical accounts we have of Jesus' life of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, because we get a glimpse into the value system that Jesus was trying to introduce. In fact, there's this one moment where Jesus is kind of saying, hey, I'm going to go to the cross, I'm going to die, and all of his crew are kind of looking around like, what, Jesus, you can't die, you're supposed to be the hero. Heroes don't die on a cross. And then this guy, Philip, kind of pipes up and he asks the question that everyone wanted to ask. He's like, hey, Jesus, would you just show us the Father? Would you give us a glimpse as to what God is like if you can? And then Jesus sort of says, well, Philip, if you've hung out with me, you have seen the Father. Philip's like, no. I've seen you. I've hung out with you. And Jesus goes, no. If you follow me, you will get a glimpse into the things that God values. And it's in this moment, and it's also later when Jesus would die on the cross, that Jesus introduced a brand new narrative into the world. And the narrative is simply this, that the world is broken. You and I know that. We just have to watch the news to know how broken the world is. But the good news is that God redeems broken things. And because God redeems broken things, what that means is you matter to God. It also means that the you beside you matters to God. This is the narrative that Jesus introduced into the world. Maybe it's the first time you've ever heard this narrative. Maybe you don't know if this narrative could be true. But something Paul says as he wraps up that letter that we were looking at a little bit earlier helps us kind of connect this narrative that Jesus has to our life today. And Paul says this, he says, we will be ready to punish every act of disobedience once your obedience is complete. Now, this is one of the most misunderstood parts of Paul's letters, but really what Paul is trying to get at is that we would act swiftly to correct misguided narratives and misguided information, to conform it to the narrative that Jesus tells, that you matter to God and that the you beside you matters to God. So let me ask you a question. Got any strongholds that need to be demolished? The answer is yes. Not because there's anything wrong with you, but just because you're human. We all have strongholds that we need to be demolished. And if you're not sure what one of those strongholds is, let me just ask you, what's your narrative behind why you won't call him, why you won't call her, why you don't talk to your mom, why you don't talk to your dad, why you haven't forgiven them? What is the story that you keep on telling yourself? Maybe it's time to demolish it. Maybe it's time, if I could be so bold, it's to make a commitment. And the commitment I want you to make is, will you commit to demolish every narrative that sets itself up against the value system that Jesus introduced into the world? Why not just try it, just for a day or for a week or maybe for a month if you want to get really adventurous, and see the difference that it makes to your life. I guarantee that you will be your own worst enemy far, far less if you do. Hey, thanks for checking out this video. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. And to stay up to date with all of our content, subscribe. And if you've got a friend in mind who you think this might be helpful for, why not share it with them? And if you're stuck around all the way to the end, why don't you let me know the favorite thing about your parents in the comments below?